Hi, uh, welcome back to the continuing lecture in return on investment and macroeconomics. In our last video, we discussed uh, how what Fed funds rate is, and how it works. And I said also, Fed funds rate is the benchmark interest rate. Um, for a short-term uh, lending, right? Short-term interest rate. And I also said, short-term is distinction between short-term and long-term is 1 year. The line is drawn uh, in finance and accounting. The line is drawn exactly on 1 year. Any maturity less than 1 year is short term. Any maturity longer than 1 year is long term. So, on the 1 year lending situation, Fed funds rate is the benchmark interest rate. Um, so, and I also answered to my own rhetorical question, which was, what does it have to do with the Federal Reserve? And I said it has nothing to do with the answer is yes and no. I mean, it's not like the Federal Reserve. It's not like the commercial banks are borrowing from the Federal Reserve, right? In other words, Fed funds rate is not the rate applied to the commercial banks by the Federal Reserve. It has nothing to do with that. It's simply Fed funds market. Because it's called, it's called Fed funds rate because it is the rate determined by the market, called federal funds market. And of course, think about it. What else would you call it? It's all the banks, all the commercial banks within the United States, every state, right? Federally, they offer to lend and search the counterpart to borrow from on a federal level. So that's why it's called Fed funds market. Okay. But why the question, my answer to the question, yes and no. I already answered why it is no. Why Federal Reserve is not the owner of the one who owns this market, or the one who controls this market. But also, I said yes. How come? I mean, how can it be such ambivalent? Well, it is yes because in a way, Federal Reserve works through the market system, Fed funds market. It's not Federal Reserve sets the target rate for the Fed funds rate. Federal Reserve, once again, I repeat, Federal Reserve sets the target rate for the Fed funds rate. Setting the target means you can set the target, but the actual market may not conform to the target. Make sense? Think about it. If you're in the military, of course, in the U.S., Second Amendment, anybody can own the gun. But I, personally, I find it so, wrong. It's not like 1776, right? We don't need a militia. Well, it's a political, moot point, but I personally find it an anachronism. But anyway, if you are in the military or in police, regularly you do there is what they call PRI, rifle primary rifle instruction. That's when you learn to shoot for the first time if you're in the boot camp, and then regularly you have to do the target practice, and doing. Why do you do the target practice? Because you may not hit you don't hit the target all the time, right? But if you're a good if you're a good shot, uh, your accuracy would increase. But the fact that there's a target rate means the actual Fed funds market rate can be different. It may overshoot or undershoot the target. Make sense? So if Federal Reserve sets the target rate, if the Federal Reserve sets the target rate, then how will they ensure that the actual market rate is close to the target rate? Okay, that's through they do it through a couple of mechanisms, and one is the market mechanism. In other words, a very wonderful thing about the monetary policy and monetary theory in a market economy is that everything has to work through the market. In other words, what I'm saying is Federal Reserve sets the target rate, but then they cannot say, so we set the target rate at 3%. So from tomorrow, starting tomorrow, 0 hour, the next day, let the Fed funds rate be 3%. Actual Fed funds rate in the market be 3%. Or less, you'll get executed. No, it's not like that, right? Anyone who in the Fed funds market, if commercial banks charge anything other than the target rate, you'll be in violation and you will be punished, right? Is it going to work like that? No, it doesn't work like that. That's not a market economy. That's not a free market economy. In a free market economy, you've heard this over and over all your life. What determines the price in the market? You've heard this, demand and supply, demand and supply. Okay? They will, so Federal Reserve will work through the market system and by affecting the funds available and by affecting the demand, they try to bring the actual market rate close to the target rate. Okay, so in that sense, that market mechanism, we're going to come back to that shortly. And I said there are a couple of mechanisms they use to do that. So if we go back to the, this is a brief, recent, trend in Fed funds rate. I only posted up to December 2018. But it's a well-known fact that in 2008, what happened around, actually, you all remember 2008, that was the year, that a historic moment in the financial market, the financial crisis, right? But actually, the financial crisis was instigated by the housing market crash in 2007. Around in 2000 September, around September 2007, the housing bubble bursted. The housing market crashed, and then as a result, in 2008, full blown, a stock market. Right after the housing bubble bursted, a lot of stock market crashed too. So from already, early 2008 was full-blown financial crisis. And to fight the the recession induced by financial crisis, the Federal Reserve lowered the short-term interest rate to 0%. It's now look, the actual market rate cannot be exactly zero. So the target is not a point; it's a range. So the target range is 0 to 0.25%, and they through the market mechanism they brought it within this range. So actual market Fed funds market rate fluctuates, between within this range, and then from 2016 to until December of for 1 year. So this 0 to 0.25% Fed funds rate was held for almost 7 years, right? And then from January 2016, for 1 year they raised the rate by quarter percentage point. Now, from January of 2017 through December of 2018, they raised it to 2.25 to 2.5%. So I told you, even earlier last year, 2019, the Fed funds rate was even as high as 2.75. I mean, calling it high is really it's an oxymoron, right? 2.75% is high. I mean, compared to when it was like 15%, it's not high at all. But in recent history, now in 2020, we are back to 0% again. Okay. After the pandemic. Now, so this is like, I'm not going to go back to historical data, but right before, look at this, right before the financial crisis in January of 2009, beginning of 2009 is the same thing as end of 2008, right? It came down to 0%, close to 0%. Prior to that, even until end of 2007, it was still around 5.25%. Just over 1 year, it dropped 5%. This is a significant drop. Change of 5% percentage point change is a huge change. Now think about it. From 5% to 0, right? Now, and then 2016, right, from 0.25, this is not even 0.25, to somewhere between 0.25 and 0.5, right? So think about it. If the rate went from 0.25 to 0.5, you think that's not a big deal. It's very minuscule change, right? Minuscule increase. But you must think of it this way. From 0.25 to 0.5%, the difference is, you think it is 5%, 0.5%, 0.25%. That's actually 0.25 percentage point, right? The increase is 0.25 percentage point. We just call it 0.25%. I mean, from 0.25% to 0.5%, we just call it that way. But to be accurate, we should call it 0.25 percentage point to 0.5 percentage point. Why? Then what's the difference between percentage point and percent? Well, if the rate went from 0.25 percentage point to 0.5%, you think the difference is only, the difference is it increased by 0.25 percentage point. But think about it, in terms of really percentages, it's double. The rate doubled, right? Interest rate doubled. And what is double in percentage? 100%. It's a 100% increase. Make sense? It's a 100% increase. So that's the difference between percentage point and percent, right? The increase is 0.25 percentage point, but the in percentage, it's 100% increase, right? This is something people generally don't realize. You had, let's say, S&P 500, the stock market index. Let's say S&P 500 is currently somewhere around 3,000. Let's see. I mean, I just need a hypothetical number. I don't need the actual number. But if ever, right, so let's say S&P 500 is, hypothetically at 3,000, and it dropped to 1,500. Okay, the market index. And you think, oh, that's a 50% drop, right? Of course, that's a significant drop. Nobody wants to see something like, that means, all your, stock holdings lost value by 50%. Okay, but then what does that how much does it take to recover? I mean, to recover from 1,500 to get back to 3,000, the market has to double. Market has to double. In other words, it has to go up by 100%. Make sense? It dropped 50%, but going back up by 50% doesn't get you back to where you were before. You understand? Mm-hmm. From 1,500 going up 50% is just 750 points more than that, right? 1,500 plus 750 would bring you back to only 2,250, right? So that's why it takes more time and so harder to recover once the market loses, right? Dropping by 50%, right? It can happen overnight, right? But then crawling back to where you were before, you need to grow double, 100% from that point, right? which is more difficult than way more difficult than dropping by 50%, right? So anyway, um, with that in mind, now it becomes a lot easier. So we need to. I'm not going to go over prime rate again. We already explained this, uh, and the reason. Um, and the relationship between the interest rate and the uh, economy. First of all, uh, you may think that you might have thought high interest rate is a good thing. And I said, from the economy's macroeconomist perspective, high interest rate is not a good thing. Why? First of all, think about it. If the interest rate goes up, right? If the interest rate goes up, that's nominal interest rate. What's going to happen to the borrowing? Borrowing or the credit goes down. If the borrowing goes down, uh, what does it entail? This means money supply. Money supply goes down. Why? Because companies are not borrowing. So um, what happens? People are not borrowing because interest rate is too burdensome, so they don't buy houses. Housing market is shrinking, right? Then what happens? The construction companies, will suffer. They will lay off people, right? Construction boom is gone. There's no more, order for new housing, new buildings, construction of new buildings or houses. Construction companies will have to lay off people, workers. That's obvious. And businesses don't borrow. So what do? They don't expand. And it's not just not expanding. I mean, uh, if uh, so borrowing goes down, the credit money supply will go down because as less workers keep their jobs, uh, people who are laid off cannot spend money, right? So if they cannot spend money, then they cannot simply, restaurants will have less customers, less income coming in. Clothing stores will have less income coming in. Overall, it has throughout the economy there would be less money supply going around, less cash flow, and to the lower output of the economy. That Y stands for income. Also, I told you in the previous videos, I told you income is the output, right? Um, because output eventually turns into income. If a car company makes cars, that's their output, but they don't just sit on the cars, right? They will sell the cars, and the cars turn into income, right? Their outputs turn into income. So output is the income unto itself, unto the economy supplier or the producer themselves, right? So the economy shrinks, right? However, if and the mirror image, the opposite is the uh, exactly the mirror image, right? If the interest rate goes down, credit goes up, borrowing goes up, lending goes up, money supply goes up, and which stimulates the economy. So this is uh, something that might seem quite counterintuitive to a lot of you because I was like that. I was 40 years ago, I was an undergrad student, and as an undergrad, um, I was a liberal arts major, and I didn't know anything about the uh, how the economy works. And at the time, I didn't even take any economics courses. And then in those days we didn't have CNN at the time. We had Bloomberg News, Reuters, Reuters and Bloomberg were still around, and we didn't have CNBC at the time, or MSNBC. There was nothing like that. But Reuters, major financial news. Bloomberg, major financial. But when you don't have to tune into financial news, even on NBC or ABC News, they talk about the economy, and then one day you hear, the interest rates are up, bond prices are down. And another day they say interest rates are down, bond prices are up. And as a 18, 19-year-old, 18, 19, 20-year, I was, back in 1980, I was 19. So had no idea. I had no idea. Why? Because to me, it sounded like if interest rates are up, it sounds like a good thing. It must be a good thing. Why do they say the bond prices are down? And to me, if bond prices are down, that sounds like any price going down sounds like a bad thing, right? So it was a mystery to me. I couldn't, because to me everything, if interest rate is up, that's a good news to me. If I put my money in the bank, I will get more, money in my account in the future. In other words, my future value will be higher. That's true. But why is the bond market down? Why is the bad news to the bond market? And another day, interest rates are down. The bond market is, bond prices are good. Economy is booming. I couldn't make sense out of that. Okay. But then, only when I went to graduate school and changed my major and studied economics, then it came to me. And it's so there are many things that are counterintuitive in finance and economics. I've been telling you. One, we talked about, why inflation is not necessarily a bad thing, right? Why borrowing is not necessarily a bad thing, because intuitively they seem like a negative thing, right? But in reality, they are not. Also, the relationship between the interest rate and the economy. In other words, there is an inverse relationship. A lot of things that are inverse related, and to you they are counterintuitive, right? But that's why you need to learn economics and finance, because by thinking it teaches you logical reasoning, and through logical reasoning you understand why these things that superficially seems counterintuitive makes perfectly logical sense. Now, again, so a Federal Reserve's role is, first of all, Federal Reserve is the central bank of the United States. No other country has the name like that. The Central Bank of England is, Bank of England. Central Bank of Japan is Bank of Japan. Central Bank of South Korea is Bank of Korea, right? But only in the U.S. the central bank is called Federal Reserve. And Bank of America is not the central bank; it's just a commercial bank, right? Now, as the central bank, they are the ultimate authority in monetary policy. That means they set the target rate for federal Fed funds rate, and also and the actual Fed funds rate is determined by the supply and demand, the Fed funds market. And they are, because they are a central bank, they are the regulatory authority in commercial banking. And they are the lender of the last resort, meaning that means, when commercial banks cannot borrow anymore from the Fed funds market, then they come to the Federal Reserve to borrow. But once again, the term borrowing, this is actually a figurative expression. They do not really borrow from the Federal Reserve like borrowing from another bank. There's another way of but it's a figurative expression. But actually, what they do is get into a repurchase agreement with the Federal Reserve. It's called repo market. But we'll have to come back to that later. So in banking, there are two types of banking: commercial banking and investment banking. And back in the 1930s, there was a law called Glass-Steagall law that was legislated in the 1930s. But back in like 1990s, Glass-Steagall was repealed. So, but Glass-Steagall was actually the law that separates the commercial banking from investment banking. So they worked. Commercial banks could not get into investment banking. Investment banks could not get into commercial banking. But after late 1990, I think it was 1998 or sometime around that, the Glass-Steagall was repealed, and the commercial banks were able to get into investment banking. And this caused all that financial turmoil. Actually, the repeal of Glass-Steagall was the planting of the seed for that financial crisis. Anyway, so the commercial banking is regulated by the Federal Reserve, and the investment banking is regulated by SEC, which stands for Securities Exchange Commission. Okay. There's also an agency called CFPB, Consumer Financial Protection Bureau, which was created after the 2008 financial crisis. And this is an agency that regulates the non-bank lenders. Okay, you might wonder what are non-bank lenders, but we'll come back to this later. So this is the end of the this video. Thank you for watching, and I'll see you in the next class.